Hello, my name is Manuel Aquino, and this is Emily Van Pelt.
Hi.
Today we are going to discuss some of the research that we have worked on over the course of this past year under Dr. Rebecca Wallenberg. We have been investigating Jewish peoplehood and its development for a couple of years now, within a project titled An Alternative Biblical History. Emily, what does an alternative biblical history mean?
So, an alternative biblical history accounts for those who are not prioritized in ancient literature, such as women and concubines, or maybe even smaller characters in the Hebrew Bible. For example, Hagar is known as Sarah's handmaiden that was given to Abraham as a concubine, because Sarah had been unable to bear children. Sarah herself is a renowned matriarch of the Abraham genealogy, but Hagar is much less known or discussed in theological conversation. However, Hagar is an interesting character who had actually converted when she joined Abraham's household. She is one of the earliest examples in rabbinic literature of conversion. So by flipping this common narrative on its head, we can better understand Hagar and many other characters and how they fit into Jewish people as a whole. We've been working to do this by first combing through ancient rabbinic literature. So here's actually a quote from the Midrash about Hagar. Abraham, modest and unassuming as he was ready to do justice to Sarah, and he conferred full power upon her to dispose of Hagar according to her pleasure. He added but one caution. Having once made her a mistress, we cannot again reduce her to the state of a bondwoman. Unmindful of this warning, Sarah exacted the services of a slave from Hagar. Not only this, she tormented her, and finally she cast an evil eye upon her, so that the unborn child dropped from her and she ran away. On her flight she was met by several angels, and they bade her return, at the same time making known to her that she would bear a son who should be called Ishmael. One of the 6 men who had been given a name by God before their birth, the others being Isaac, Moses, Solomon, Josiah, and the Messiah. So that's just one example from the Midrash about Hagar, which kind of shows a lot more information that you wouldn't necessarily get if you were to just read the Hebrew Bible. And Manuel, can you define actually what rabbinic literature is?
Yeah, of course. The rabbinic literature is the preserved writings of the Jewish rabbis from the period of 70 CE, which is the date of the Second Temple destruction in Jerusalem, to 638 CE, around the end of antiquity and the beginning of the medieval era. This is the period of the reformulation of the Jewish faith and identity in the wake of the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, which had been up to that point the center and heart of Jewish faith, ritual, and practice. To preserve their identity, the writings and commentaries of the Second Temple and rabbinic rabbis on the Tanakh, that is, the Hebrew Bible, were written down in the rabbinic literature, which includes the Talmud and also the rabbinic commentaries and debates on the interpretation of the Hebrew Bible. These commentaries are referred to as midrash and often expand on the roles of various characters in the Hebrew Bible. For example, the midrash expands on a character like Miriam, who was Moses' sister, and prophesied that he would be born to save the Hebrews enslaved in Egypt. I'm quoting now from the Megillah in the midrash. But once Moses was cast into the river, her father arose and rapped her on the head, saying to her, "My daughter, where is your prophecy now?" as it looked as though the young Moses would soon meet his end. This is the meaning of that which is written with regard to Miriam's watching Moses in the river. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him, i.e., to know what would be the end of her prophecy, as she had prophesied that her brother was destined to be the savior of the Jewish people. We see here now how in the rabbinic literature Miriam plays a much more central role to the salvation of Moses and his adoption by the Egyptians, and to the salvation of the Hebrew people entirely. Now, earlier you mentioned characters like Sarah or Hagar as matriarchs. What are the biblical matriarchs?
So, the biblical matriarchs are the central female characters in the Hebrew Bible who are responsible for the foundation of Jewish faith and identity. In the Hebrew Bible, these characters are directly responsible for giving birth and raising the earliest ancestors of the Jewish people. So, in the book of Genesis, these matriarchs, like Sarah, the wife of Abraham and the mother of Isaac, Hagar, who we mentioned earlier, the enslaved woman who also married Abraham and gave birth to Ishmael, Rebecca, Isaac's wife and the mother of Esau and Jacob, Leah and Rachel, Bilhah, or even Zilpah, who all were married to Jacob and the mothers of the 12 tribes of Israel. They corresponded to the biblical patriarchs, and they play a direct role in legendary Jewish history and the formation of the identity of the Jewish people. In our research, we didn't just focus on those characters alone, but also included as matriarchs the characters of Miriam, Moses' sister, and one of the leaders of the Exodus, Zipporah, Moses' wife, Rahab, the sex worker who helped the Israelites take Jericho, and in some traditions became Joshua's wife, and Ruth, the Moabite woman, who is the protagonist of the book of Ruth, and became an ancestor of King David. In the Bible, these characters all directly influence the development of Jewish peoplehood.
By contrast, what exactly is early Christian reception?
So, early Christian reception can encompass both literature and community reactions, but if we zoom specifically in on the literature side of things, the Church Fathers are our best source when trying to glean how an early educated Christian had viewed theological issues like identity, conversion, and what exactly makes a model religious person. They were ancient theologians who are known to establish the foundations of Christianity as an organized religion. Most come from the 1st to the 8th centuries. Some of the most prominent church fathers include Irenaeus, who is best known for his defense of orthodoxy, Justin Martyr, who is considered a saint of the Catholic Church, and Ignatius, who was actually said to be a student of the Apostle John. I am curious, though, what is the difference between rabbinic reception and early Christian reception?
I'd say the difference between rabbinic reception and early Christian reception is that the writings of the early Christian church fathers are similar to the rabbinic literature and that they both try to rewrite the figures of the Hebrew Bible as moral exemplars, but the early Christian writings instead differ due to their strong polemic and evidence of early anti-Semitism, born from a desire to create a Gentile Christian identity separate from Jewish identity. For example, the character of Hagar is interpreted differently in rabbinic and early Christian reception. In rabbinic reception, she is often portrayed as a pious moral exemplar to whom angels speak, and who later even remarries Abraham after Sarah dies. By contrast, the early Christian reception, especially in the writings of the early church father John Chrysostom, portrays Abraham and Sarah as perfect moral exemplars, while Hagar is depicted as the villain in the narrative. She is an allegorical representation of the flesh, of lust, and of Judaism, while Sarar is instead an allegorical representation of the spiritual nature of Christianity.
I see. Can you actually give me an example of that?
Yeah. Alongside those elements, Chrysostom's reading also tries to support an existing status quo and the continued use of slave labor. I quote now from one of Chrysostom's homilies. That is to say, probably because Sarah punished Hagar's insolence, the slave girl took to flight. This is the way with slaves, after all. Whenever they are not permitted to have their own way, but rather their efforts at independence are thwarted, immediately they throw off the yoke of their masters and take to flight. Chrysostom's reading exemplifies the anti-Semitism and concern with sexual morality that typified early Christian reception of the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah, that's true, especially if you were to compare that side by side with the passage I read earlier. So what does this research reveal about the development of Jewish identity?
By studying the rabbinic reception of these characters, we can uncover what they meant to Jewish identity and self-perception. They reveal how Jewish peoplehood was a commitment based on faith and a shared vision of God, transcending ethnic boundaries. Since many of these characters were not Jewish or Israelites, but all brought something valuable and important to the Jewish lineage, it challenges the common perceptions that rabbinic Judaism was an exclusive ethnic religion and reveals how Judaism embraced conversion and a universal shared commitment to a God, a faith, and a way of life.
And this is also interesting. Well, thank you all for listening to our discussion on how some of these lesser-known characters can fit into Jewish peoplehood.
Thank you, and goodbye.